Hey everybody, welcome to the Gray Havens podcast. My name is Dave Radford, part of the band The Gray Havens that I'm in together with my wife Alicia, and thanks for checking it out. We've been dreaming about a podcast for a while and finally have some time to do it, and the spark that kind of set me down the path of recording this thing is the release of our upcoming album, Blue Flower. We've put out a few songs from that album so far, and I thought it would be maybe interesting to tell some of those stories behind the songs. You know, what was the original spark for the album? That's the subject of today's podcast. But what were the stories behind each song as far as the writing process, the recording process, any setbacks or roadblocks or breakthroughs, or really, it's just anything interesting that I might want to hear if one of my favorite bands made a podcast. It's to try and enhance the listening experience for you guys or anybody who happens to stumble across our music. So once again, thanks so much for stopping by. And without further ado, here we go. What do you write about when you have nothing to say? That was the question I was asking myself around spring of 2019. We were on a tour traveling around the country with our band members and our then 3-year-old Simon, and fairly low on energy, probably more low on energy than we had been on tour. And even though in some ways we had about half the tour left at this point, and in some ways I was looking forward to finishing out and going home, in other ways I was dreading the tour being over, because I knew that once we got back home, it would be time for me to start writing for another album. And back to the question, what do you do when you don't feel like you have anything interesting to say? And I'm historically already not a very, if you're familiar with our music, you know, in the past when people have asked us to describe our music, we've given answers like narrative pop folk, narrative art pop, narrative cinematic. I mean, the narrative is the common thread, and it's usually not a narrative about, you know, what I'm feeling at the moment. It's more, that's just not the type of songwriter I am. But I didn't have any concepts this time around in the hopper for a new theme, and I didn't want to start trying to write journal entry style, because they would have been songs with titles like, I don't know, I'm tired. Why is the coffee gone? I have no idea. There's a crying 3-year-old. Help. Let's start a coffee shop. I mean, those are song titles that would have been the front runners. So to avoid that, I thankfully was presented with a book that got me interested. But first, I want to read this quote. It was texted to me by our friend and producer Ben Shive during a particularly dry spell that I was going through and writing lyrics for our last album called She Waits. And he texted me this quote, and I've remembered it and kept it on my phone ever since. And it reads like this. I can't do the Tom Waits voice. You know, you just got to imagine like a gravelly voice that sounds like it's swallowed broken glass or something. But the quote is, well, Music is emotional, once you transcend the equipment. I like sitting at the piano. I like the idea that there are things coming in through the window and through you, and then down to the piano and out the window on the other side. If you want to catch songs, you got to start thinking like one and making yourself an interesting place for them to land, like birds or insects. Once you get 2 or 3 tunes together, wherever 3 or more are gathered, then others come. It's like a line for a hot dog place, you know? And when there's 4 people lined up on the sidewalk, some people will stop and get in line just 'cause there's a line. I love that quote. Everything about it. It's about becoming interested. Interested people, somebody said this, I forget who. Interested people are more likely to be interesting people. And I think that's probably true. I also like that the quote is about making space, about momentum, where there's 4 people lined up on the sidewalk, people just get in line because there's a line. So there's this kind of sense of, try to get interested, try to attract songs, and that's sort of, I bring that quote up because that's sort of a picture of what happened, sort of out of nowhere. It was brought to memory that a friend a long time ago had recommended a book that I read. And it was by an author named Michael Ward, and the book was called Planet Narnia. Now, just to cut this off right away in case anybody is thinking the ending of the story, and I don't want to let anybody down, but the album is not a Planet Narnia album, just saying that right out of the gate. But it got me interested in reading C.S. Lewis again. Basically, the premise of Planet Narnia is that the author argues that Lewis sort of archetypes each of his 7 Chronicles of Narnia books after the attributes that are historically been given to the 7 planets in the medieval planetary system. It's very intriguing. I was totally convinced, and you'd have to read it to decide for yourself. But the point is, it got me really interested with Lewis's writing yet again. I personally started reading Lewis in college, though I had heard him quoted a lot growing up. My dad is a pastor and would quote Lewis a lot. I started reading the Chronicles of Narnia in college, and like millions of other readers, I fell in love with the characters, the place, the way the stories made me feel, and if you've read them, you probably know exactly what I mean. So after reading this book, I decided to read a lot of other Lewis books and was in the back of my mind sort of looking for a concept to write about. I thought, this is a deep well here that I could maybe tap into and try to find some sort of thing to go on for a new album. So fast forward now about a month or 2, I had started to form this half, conceived idea of what I wanted the album to be about. But then I stumbled onto Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy. And this was, to me, more of a due diligence read. I had read a couple biographies on Lewis and thought it would be good to hear Lewis tell his own story. I'd heard it quoted, many times, but I never picked it up. And I was very taken with the book in the first few chapters. The book is primarily about an intense longing Lewis felt throughout his life. It's like a memoir of his life through the lens of a feeling that he calls joy, which he defines as, quote, an unsatisfied desire more desirable than any satisfaction. He calls it a stab of longing. He calls it the thrill, or that sickness better than health. The German word Sehnsucht, or again, as Lewis calls it, joy. So at the heart of joy is this desire for something more, just beyond one's grasp, frustratingly so. And it surfaced for Lewis at an early age and would sort of rush in only to vanish again with varying levels of frequency throughout his life. And these episodes were triggered by, could have been nature, could have been a story he read, could have been the cover of a book, could have been out of nowhere. But again, joy was only a pointer beyond the experience itself to something else. And you might be listening to this first episode of the podcast and thinking, yeah, that's awesome, but what's up with the blue flower? And that would be a very good question right about now. And early in the book, I landed on a sentence which I thought was interesting at the time. I may have looked up its meaning right away or come back to it, but I know I highlighted it. But later on, this paragraph would become the symbol and anchor point for the album. So here's a little bit of runway before I get to the sentence. I'm quoting Lewis here, talking about an early instance of what he would call joy, the unsatisfied desire, more desirable than any satisfaction. He says, quote, "Once in those very, very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers, so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. What the real garden had failed to do, the toy garden did." And I'm skipping ahead a little bit here. He says again, as long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden. And every day there were what we called the green hills, getting closer to the sentence. That is the low line of the Castlereagh Hills, which we saw from the nursery windows. They were not very far off, but they were to children quite unattainable. Here it is. They taught me longing, Sehnsucht, made me for good or ill, and before I was 6 years old, a votary of the blue flower. And I read that, and I'm like, what? That is the only time in the book the blue flower is mentioned. And when it does come up, no definition is given. It's like it's a hyperlink that you are supposed to be able to know what it's linked to. And I didn't. So I looked it up. It turns out the blue flower was a symbol used in German literature to symbolize the very thing that Lewis is describing in his book. In one of his biographies by a guy named Alistair McGrath writes, "And what of the blue flower? Leading German romantic writers such as Novalis and Joseph von Eichendorff," hopefully I'm getting those names right, "used the image of a blue flower as a symbol of the wanderings and yearnings of the human soul, especially as this sense of longing is evoked, though not satisfied by the natural world." So there it was. That was the first spark for the concept that became our album, Blue Flower. And in the next episode, we'll talk a bit more about the blue flower and go into how we wrote and recorded the title track. That's where we're going to leave it for now. I hope you join us for episode 2. If you like the episode, we'd love it if you saved, like, subscribe, shared on social media. Anything you can do to kind of help spread the word helps us a ton. And thanks so much for listening to the first episode. Hope you come back for the next one, which is now available. And we're going to end this first episode by playing the song Blue Flower. Thanks for listening, guys.
I saw your blue flower. Now who's to say where you come from? far away. Felt your blue flower in my soul. You got me longing for something more. Now I want something more. Where are you, blue flower? Come back and stay, 'cause I can't find anything better.